It's exciting, and want to thank Lisa Rice and the team. Give them a round of applause for organizing this important conversation. Governor Barr, thank you. You're in high demand. You're busy, and we just think we're grateful that you spent time with us this morning. I want to begin just with a very simple question because the Fed is in the news, but a lot of people are not clear on what the Fed does. So I think to set up this conversation, I think it would be helpful to take us back to some basics about what the Federal Reserve does and why it's so important.
Well, thank you. First of all, let me also thank Lisa Rice and the National Fair Housing Alliance for inviting me here. And it's just an honor to be able to sit with, I still call him Mayor Morial, because we met when he was a mayor, and he was an amazing mayor, let me just tell you.
Thank you.
And is an amazing president now with the National Urban League, now for many years, over 20 years.
Yeah. Don't remind me. It's been a good run, but I'm trying to defy the age clock, y'all.
But so it's a real honor to be here. So the Federal Reserve, I think you're right. It's an institution that many people may not know about or fully understand, but we have a bunch of different duties. So one duty is Congress has assigned us the task of trying to use our tools, which are very limited but powerful, to help assure that the economy is operating to the best we can at maximum employment with price stability. Price stability is sort of the opposite of lots of inflation. So we try and help the economy, guide the economy in a way that maximizes the number of jobs in the economy and keeps prices stable. And our primary tool for doing that is to adjust the interest rates. And that helps us modulate the economy, alter the economy in a way that achieves those goals. We've been doing a lot of work on that. We brought inflation from very, very high levels in 2022 down to about 3% today. But we have more work to do to get it all the way to our goal of 2%. A second big thing that we do that people don't know is we kind of run the plumbing of the payment system. So how people get and receive money. The Federal Reserve stands behind all the stuff that you see going on in the private sector. Behind that is the Federal Reserve helping the payment system work. A third really important thing we do, and it's central to the mission today, is we advance consumer and community development. And right now I'm the oversight governor for that part of the Federal Reserve, focusing on consumer issues and community development issues. So that's a third basic mission of the Federal Reserve. And I could go on, but those are the things I think people might connect with most.
That's a great primer. So we're going to talk this morning about artificial intelligence, the capital markets, and civil rights. And again, I think people here may have a sense, we all do, but all of a sudden, artificial intelligence, the term, is central to almost every discussion we're having about the economy. What is artificial intelligence?
So artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. So really since the 1950s, companies have been using artificial intelligence. And in the traditional form, if you will, of artificial intelligence, people think of that as machine learning. So using computers to try and predict what actions might happen in the future, or to analyze data in the past to see trends. So what is different about today, beginning in 2022, there began to be widespread use in the consumer space of something called generative AI. And generative AI uses a particular form of artificial intelligence. Not all of it, but a lot of it uses large language models. And large language models are a particular kind of predictive model that generative AI uses to help advance some kind of goal. So the kinds of things that generative AI are used for are things like coding. It turns out AI is really good at coding, including coding itself. So there's a lot of advance in that, or summarizing materials, or generating new content. new stories or new narratives or new ways of describing phenomena in the world, or even, as we've seen, new photographs or new video that are synthetically created by generative AI. So there's a lot of potential applications in the economy.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion today, because on one hand, people are excited about what AI can do. On the other hand, there's great fear about disruptions and diminutions that could occur. Like any change that comes, there's good and there's bad. So let's talk about AI first in terms of its impact on the economy, on capital markets, on what is your sense of, number one, the impact so far, and what do you think the future may hold?
So it's a great question. So let me start with the present and the past, and then I'll talk a little bit about the future. So one big impact that generative AI, that AI is happening in recent years, is there's been a massive investment in the AI sector. You have very large companies investing billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars into AI models, into training AI models, building AI models, deploying AI models. And then these models require lots of data and lots of processing. So you've seen a huge amount of investment in data centers all over the country. You've seen it happen. So one positive thing about that is there's been significant business investment, and that's helped drive the economy over the last few years. It also has had some negative impacts. So some of the data center work can increase energy prices in some communities, or lead to dislocations in local communities that are not ready for the infrastructure required for data centers. In other communities, data centers are creating jobs and bringing people to local communities. So it's that kind of picture. Now, people are wondering what effect it's going to have on productivity and on the labor market. So on the labor market so far, the effects have been, we think, relatively small. So you can see a little bit of it in the data. AI seems to be probably affecting job opportunities for young workers in particular fields that are heavily exposed to AI, like computer programming. But we're not seeing it broadly in the economy. That may come. And in terms of productivity, the same thing. We have very high productivity right now that's helped our economy grow over the last 4 or 5 years. Very high productivity. That's probably not yet driven by AI. That's mostly, the United States is an incredibly entrepreneurial economy, and so those new businesses are more productive, and they compete with existing businesses and make them more productive. And coming out of the COVID crisis, businesses invested in new ways of doing business, new business processes, new technologies, because labor was so tight back in the COVID crisis. So there's elevated productivity now, probably not yet from AI. It's going to take AI a while to increase productivity, because at the beginning, businesses invest a lot in AI, but don't get that much data. And then it's more effective. J curve in growth, and you'll see, I think, much more productivity in the future. So what does that mean in terms of the labor market? I think in the long term, it means we're going to be a more productive economy. We're going to have more jobs. We're going to have people who get higher wages because they're more productive. But in the short term, it could be really disruptive to lots of people and cause a lot of pain and angst in people whose jobs are put at risk or whose jobs disappear while the new jobs are being created. And so it's really important that we as a society invest in supporting people who need help because of that disruption, or need help to take advantage of that new technology.
So a series of questions. So you mentioned right now, so much capital is being invested in AI and AI-related businesses, which typically can have a disruptive effect on the stock market, right? And the equity markets, because money that may have been invested over here is being invested over there in AI because people may be chasing the rainbow or the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So I want to ask you about that. But then secondly, there's the potential impact that AI could have on the entire software as a service sector, an entire sector, which is really a whole industry of businesses that have popped up over the last 20 years. And some of them have been enormously successful, highly profitable, and have employed a lot of people. So it's really two questions, and stick with me, audience. It's the impact that AI is having on an economy and on a business sector that's grown, and also this sort of chase the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So my fearful side says, is this a new dot-com boom that all of a sudden, boom, people are chasing, and then it's just not there anymore? So try to unpack maybe those two questions.
Yeah, so let me start with a caveat, which is at the Federal Reserve, we're really careful not to comment on the level of the stock market. So I'm not commenting on whether it's the right level or the wrong level. So what I try and do in thinking about this, none of us have a crystal ball. So I try and think about different scenarios that might play out. And then, each person can assign different probabilities to those scenarios, but I think it helps clarify the thinking if you think, well, what would it take for this to be a good outcome or a bad outcome? So when you think about the investment in artificial intelligence, it's likely the case that artificial intelligence will have a profound effect on our economy in the future. And so it makes sense that to that extent that businesses are investing in this technology. And that might turn out to be kind of worth the level of investment that's happening if the returns happen fast enough. But it's possible that those returns won't happen fast enough. And that, as you said, there's a lot of money chasing these returns. Somebody in the audience didn't like my answer because the lights went out. It's possible that the returns won't come fast enough. And so investors might lose money out of that. And I think part of the bet here is that people are betting that a handful of winners are going to win this race. And so they're willing to take losses in the short term because if they're the last person standing, then they're going to reap the benefit of these gains that may be long-term gains. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is there might be a scenario in which it turns out AI is not that interesting. Like I think of it, I'm quite optimistic about it. I think that it's likely to be quite productive, but it's also possible that it turns out it's, a little bit more convenient or a little bit better for businesses overall. It might make a big difference in coding, but for most businesses, maybe it turns out not to be that interesting, in which case the whole sector would have been overinvested in. Or it might have even better outcomes than people think. That is, it might create productivity gains, not only of the kind that we saw, in the 1990s when you were mayor in the internet boom, we saw a massive increase in productivity. It might be like that, but not the kind of boom that some people are expecting, where you see productivity at 3% or 4% or 10%, which some people are predicting. So it all depends on these different scenarios. And I don't want to pretend that I know the answer to that.
So let's maybe move to this issue of income inequality. So just a data point, and that is in third quarter of 2025, it appears as though the top 1% of U.S. households own 31%, almost a third of the wealth in the country. So there's a great concern that I think many of us have, I know we do at the National Urban League, that AI, one of the disruptions is that it will exacerbate the income inequality situation in the country, which has some very difficult and negative social and economic consequences, but also political consequences in creating a backlash amongst voters and people against artificial intelligence, because they feel, well, hey, okay, but it's only going to benefit some, or it's going to mostly benefit some. The question really is you, I think, played a significant role post the Great Recession in sort of helping to design the policy interventions whose purpose it was to prevent the Great Recession from happening again. What are the policy interventions needed at this point? Because this race is happening with very few guardrails. What are the policy interventions that would be, I think, helpful to avoid this continuing concentration of wealth?
So it's a great question, and I think a central concern for many people is AI going to exacerbate income inequality and wealth inequality,
Yes.
both? So why would people be worried? So one thing is, as you said, there's already a great concentration of wealth in terms of stock ownership. And if stocks are the main, if AI keeps driving up stock wealth, lots of people will be left behind. There's a worry about the mix between labor and capital in our society more broadly. So if it turns out that capital, that machines can do lots of things that humans can do, then maybe there's less weight on labor income and more on capital income, which would mean even higher returns to capital, more wealth inequality. And if labor can't get the gains from that productivity, more income inequality. So there are some things that might play on the other side, and then I'll talk about policy. So one thing that might help that is that might help income inequality is that AI might also help people on the low end of the spectrum have higher productivity, and therefore their wages can go up. So for example, early evidence from call centers suggests that people who are inexperienced in call centers benefit the most from using artificial intelligence as a friend, as a pilot, as a co-pilot, and so their wages can go up. So there are some things that might offset that, but I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about both wealth inequality and income inequality. And there are many things that have to happen that are far beyond anything the Federal Reserve has any authority to do. There are things for Congress to consider, but there are things like investments in job training. You know, in US history, you know this well, we have not done the investment that people need when there's big technological change or trade change in the past. We have not made enough investment in job training and retraining. And if we care about wealth and income inequality, we're going to need to do that with respect to artificial intelligence. We may need to invest in jobs themselves. So, you know, Gene Sperling, who I know you know well, has written about this. We might need to invest in the health sector and in the caring sector, where we need more people doing jobs that are not going to be replaced by AI. They'll be augmented by AI. We might need to invest more in the caring professions. We might need to think about tax policy. Again, far outside anything that's in the Federal Reserve purview, but Congress might need to think about, do we have to change our tax system to understand that there's going to be more returns to capital potentially and lower returns to labor? So there are a bunch of, I think, very large policy questions that society needs to address. And the earlier we address it, the better it is, because this technology is moving very, very fast.
Yeah, and I think one of the great concerns is that it's also occurring at a time when there's been a deliberate effort to dismantle and undermine some of the post-recession regulatory framework. Think of the CFPB or think of the Community Reinvestment Act. So at a time when even those structures, which may be limited, they're being undermined in this instance. So the question, it's a broader question, and that is, can the nation make this journey in an environment where it might be more like the Wild Wild West? There's no guardrails, there's no framework, there's nothing. Just let it be, que sera, what will be, will be. Is that good for society is really the question, where we're seeing this occur in an environment where even the long-standing regulatory systems like the CFPB and the Community Reinvestment Act are being gutted, being undermined, being muted, being spayed, actually being neutered. That's an important question. What insight can you offer?
I agree with you very much, Mark, that, we're at significant risk, particularly, the area that I know the best is the financial services
Yes.
space. It's happening in many other areas of our society. But in financial services, those guardrails are being weakened. And I do think it creates additional risk. It creates risk to safety and soundness, to risk that will repeat the problems of the past. As you said, in the global financial crisis, in the lead up to that, one of the problems was regulation was weakened. And in the S&L crisis and savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, leading up to that, regulations were weakened. And in the regional bank crisis we had in 2023, before that, oversight of those regional banks was weakened. So if you look at these patterns in history, people start to get complacent, or the political mood in Washington changes, and regulation starts to weaken, and you get a little sugar high at first, but that bill comes due. It always comes due. And so down the road, you might have greater risk. And at the Federal Reserve, I've been dissenting a lot lately on policies affecting regulation, because I think the steps that are being taken at the Fed are weakening regulation. And as you said, at other agencies, we do consumer protection of smaller banks and risk assessments of big banks for consumer protection at the Federal Reserve. But we need to have partners to do that. We used to have a very strong Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was our partner in making sure that supervision was strong, and that partner is being gutted.
Mm-hmm.
And the CFPB is the only agency that supervises non-bank institutions. The Federal Reserve doesn't supervise those institutions, the CFPB does, and they're not doing it now. That's a huge risk to the system. The Community Reinvestment Act, which we worked on together, 30 years ago, trying to preserve it and strengthen it, has been a bipartisan effort, has been an effort that banks and civil rights organizations and community groups all supported. In 2023, we put out a stronger CRA rule, and the banks attacked it and sued us for it and stopped it. So we're in an environment, even before the latest changes, where civil rights principles are under attack. And so I think it's an absolutely critical moment for our country. And the kind of country I want to live in is a country with good guardrails and good, strong civil rights protections and good, strong enforcement and supervision.
What concerns me is collective amnesia. And if you think about the tech sector in the late 1990s, the thinking was, this is an innovative, embryonic sector of startups. Let's not over-regulate. Let's not create too many guardrails now, lest we crush this innovation. Well, those startups, those embryonic companies, are now the largest market cap companies in the world. In that 30-year arc, think of what has occurred. And the idea was, let's not put any guardrails on them. Let's not put any regulation on them, lest we'll strangle the goose that laid the golden egg. Now, 20 and 30 years later, it is in the civil justice system where people are seeking to put guardrails on many of these companies. And there have been lawsuits recently that have been filed. Secondly, and you know this, when Sarbanes-Oxley came of being, it was in response to a crisis. When the CFPB and the post-recession regulatory framework came, it was in response to a crisis that almost took the American economy down. One of my questions is, do we have such an amnesia where we just say, well, let it be, and then when the crisis comes, there'll be an effort to regulate? I mean, are we so forgetful? Are we so thoughtless that we can't learn from the past? And that's one of my concerns. And you talked about these, and I think sometimes the financial services industry has a love-hate relationship with the unregulated fintech industry. Because on one hand, they are their competitors, but on the other hand, they are financing them and banking them and helping them to architect their capital markets, if you will, play. How do we reconcile all of this? What should those that want to lead this country in the future, whether legislators or executives, be thinking about? And what would you say, because you've been there through all of this and played a vital role in trying to design a system of regulations or a system of partnership between government and the private sector that on one hand doesn't stifle growth, but on the other hand seeks to protect people. What do leaders who want to lead this country, whose head may be spinning because they hear one argument, which is don't stifle growth. On the other hand, they hear the argument, let's ensure that people are not going to be hurt, that income inequality is not going to be advanced. What say you to, if they want to, they come and say, Michael Barr, you have been there. What should I be thinking? How do I reconcile these competing interests?
Look, I think you make just an absolutely critical point. We do need to support innovation. We need to be pro-innovation. Innovation can help our economy grow faster, can help increase productivity, can help increase wages for people, but it's got to be done with intentionality. So if you don't engage in these efforts with intentionality, you're going to leave people behind. You're going to hurt people. And that's why you do need guardrails. You need guardrails to protect people. You need guardrails so there's clear rules of the road, so people are competing on a level playing field. You need guardrails so that people are not taken advantage of by these new technologies. And you need to make sure that the people working on the technologies are focused on bringing everybody along in the process. And I think you're right that if you look, in history, you see these cycles of forgetfulness, collective amnesia. And sometimes that amnesia is paid for, not just naturally occurring. And so you have to guard against that kind of amnesia blocking society from putting in place the guardrails that are needed so that our society can move forward together. I think there's an enormous amount of work to do on that. Again, in the financial services space, we can start by not weakening the guardrails that we already have and making sure that the guardrails that we put in place for the future are adequate to the rapid changes in technology we're seeing. And we can do all that while being pro-innovation. There's not a conflict between those things. If you have smart regulation, that is pro-innovation. It's letting competition happen in a way that serves the entire society, not just a few.
Is the historic regulatory framework, we have the Community Reinvestment Act, we have the CFPB, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, we have the OCC, you guys all know what all of that is. Is that a sufficient system to confront this new age of AI, Bitcoin, fintechs, or do we need to create a whole new regime? Or do we need to just wait until we have this massive crisis and then we'll have maybe the traction? So is the existing set of frameworks, rules, and agencies sufficient to confront today's changing and innovative economy, or do we have to kind of start over or do something different? I think that's a legitimate question to be asked.
Well, let me start with the second part of your question, which is, do we have to wait for a crisis for this to happen? Now, it is true that historically that's been the moment when you've seen the most change. But I don't want us to suffer through that in order to get that change. I mean, I spent most of the last 25 years at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is a very affluent, stable community. But in the lead up to the financial crisis, in 2006 and 7 and 8 and then 9 and 10, I saw my neighbors lose their jobs, and I saw my neighbors lose their homes, and I saw my neighbors close their businesses, and it's painful. It causes enormous harm to people. So I don't want us to be forced to endure some crisis that hurts a lot of people in order for us to do the things that we think are the right things to do for our society. And, again, I think we can start with strengthening the system we have now, making sure we're not undermining that system. We can make sure that our civil rights laws are fully protected, not weakened as they're being done now. We can ensure that our consumer financial protection is strong and not weaker. And then we need to think about, how do we extend that to other areas of society? So in building the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, one thing we wanted to be sure of is that they weren't just regulating banks, they were also regulating the non-bank sector. And again, that's not happening right now, but having a level playing field is really important, or you get a race to the bottom. The banks say, well, that fintech is doing it, I'm going to go do it.
Yeah, right.
And
right.
And if the fintech can't do it because they're properly regulated, because there's good guardrails in place, then everybody's standards are lifted and you can compete on that higher level playing field. Obviously the Community Reinvestment Act was put in place in 1977, and a lot in the world has changed since then. And it does, I think, need to be updated for all the changes that have happened in the banking sector and in the non-bank sector since then. Again, in 2023, we made an effort to do that. It wasn't perfect. I mean, none of it was perfect, but I think it pushed us in the right direction. And there may be statutory changes that have to happen to bring it all the way up to modernity. And when you get into the crypto world, there's been this argument about, do we need a specialized system, or can the existing securities laws apply? The most important principle for me is that whatever your technology is called, that the same rules apply for the same kinds of risks, and that the same protections apply whether a consumer is confronting a problem with Bitcoin or a security or another product. We should have uniform rules of the road. And you can create a specialized unit to do that, or you can make sure that the existing laws cover it, but you need to have that same high standard. And the same with the use of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence might advance civil rights. If it's used properly, it might open up more opportunities to lend to more people using new techniques to determine their creditworthiness. But it might also reinforce discrimination in our society if we're not careful, because AI is ingesting everything out there in the world, and there's a lot of things out there in the world that are deeply, deeply discriminatory. So it depends on having intentionality about it.
In early 2007, I'll never forget, I was asked to go to the National Press Club and have a conversation about housing and the economy. And I remember sitting down, Lisa, with Cy and Dr. Bernard Anderson to try to figure out what we were going to say. And they said, let's look at what's happening. And I remember the job market was weakening. The number of jobs being created was beginning to decline. The foreclosures and the debt load, consumer debt load that people were experiencing. And I remember thinking, we need to say something a little bit bold. And so I went over there and pretty much said that there were yellow lights on the horizon. This is before the recession. and that the weakening job market, the increasing number of foreclosures were a great potential risk to the economy. We kind of got accused of being Chicken Little. You're doom and gloom. Everything is going to be okay. Now, this is in winter, spring of '07, before all hell breaks loose. And then I remember getting called or asked to participate in a briefing when Hank Paulson, really, for the most part, pushed the alarm bell on what was happening in the economy in the September. I don't know what time period it was. Maybe it was in '08. It was a little bit later. It was in '08, right? And thinking, boy, we were concerned about this, and we were accused of being Chicken Little, but in many respects, the warning signs were there. Now I see job losses. I see Black unemployment spiking on its way to probably 8%, significant layoffs of African American women in the professional sector. These are people who have college degrees and law degrees and MBAs and MPPs, all of a sudden for the first time in their life, finding themselves unemployed. Then on the other hand, we see stagnant growth, impact of tariffs, a foreign intervention that is costing us $2 billion a day. Are the yellow lights on the American economy all of a sudden again? I hear people saying everything's going to be okay. But then I look at the data sets, and it doesn't point to robust growth, low unemployment, or job creation in the future. Should we be seeing yellow lights, particularly those of us that are highly concerned about working people, communities of color? Are these yellow lights that are about to go red on us?
It's a great question. Let me start by saying, back in 2007, I remember the civil rights community sounding the alarm on the potential for there to be a financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke out, other civil rights leaders spoke out, Martin Meeks from the Center for Responsible Lending. The civil rights community said, we're seeing a canary in the coal mine here. We're seeing risk in the subprime sector that has spread, and people discounted it. They said, no, that's contained. That's not going to spread. It's not systemic. They said things that were, it turned out, not true. And so I think that it does make sense for, our political leaders and our economic leaders to look to see where there might be risks developing, and people raising their hand and saying, I'm worried. It could be a broader kind of concern. It's a concern in its own right, but it could also be a broader kind of concern. So, let me say, my view of where we are overall in the economy. I'll talk about inflation, I'll talk about growth, and I'll talk about the labor market. So on inflation, we were making a lot of progress. We went from over 7% down to 3%, and we were heading under 3% to 2.5%. And then inflation started to go back up, and that's largely due to tariffs. So tariffs increased goods prices, and good price inflation offset the progress that had been made in housing or in services. And so that brought us back up to 3%. And, the hope is that as those tariff effects kind of wane, that is, the price stays high, but it doesn't keep going up. As those effects wane, then we'll start our path back down to 2%. But then we just got hit with another shock, which is the conflict in the Middle East, which is driving up energy prices. People see it obviously at the pump.
And disrupting the supply chain generally, right?
It could be. We're not seeing that yet, but a real risk is that it could snarl supply chains. Navigation through the Strait of Hormuz is really important, not just for oil, but also natural gas production in the region, critical elements that go into fertilizer. So fertilizer prices are starting to climb. That will feed into food prices. There are critical elements like aluminum that travel and helium that travel through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's possible we could begin to see these broader effects, and then you start to worry about inflation rising again. So that's the concern on inflation. So there's risk on inflation. In terms of growth has been quite strong over the last 4 or 5 years, really since the pandemic. Really strong economic growth continuing now, buoyed by resilient consumer spending and this business investment that I was talking about. But there are risks to growth. Could be because of the AI issues we were talking about, or the conflict in the Middle East might not only hurt inflation, but also hurt growth if it lasts for a long time. If it's over quickly and resolved quickly, the effects will also dissipate quickly. But if the conflict persists, then it could have these longer term effects on growth. And that, comes to the labor market. The labor market is in an unusual place in terms of U.S. history in the following sense. We have pretty low aggregate unemployment at 4.4%. You're right that African-American unemployment has been rising. It was very low, and
low
very historically low, and it has now been rising in a way that is, disturbing.
Troubling.
Got to watch out for. But overall unemployment has been relatively low to date. But we have this unusual circumstance where there's basically been zero job creation over the last year on net. Society is creating new jobs all the time, and jobs are shrinking all the time. But on net, there's been zero job creation. And the reason the unemployment rate hasn't moved is because the labor force has also not grown. There's been zero growth, essentially zero growth in the labor force. So zero new jobs kind of matches with zero labor force growth. That is largely because of a significant decline in immigration, a massive decline in immigration on net, and somewhat lower labor force participation. So we're in this unusual circumstance, and when you have job creation at zero, even if the unemployment rate is low, that economy is at risk if there are further shocks to the system. And the Middle East conflict, if it persists, might be that kind of shock, or there might be other shocks.
You mentioned lack of growth in the labor force. It's also lack of the number of children being born to both American white families and American black families is declining. We have an aging population, which also takes people out of the labor force. And one of the concerns with, and you mentioned immigration, is we move in the direction of a country like Japan, where you get stagnated, you don't have any population growth, and you can't really grow your economy. Population growth grows the economy. New homes, new cars, education demand. It's a really significant driver that many times we don't fully and fundamentally understand. I think, just my own commentary, I think the president's going to speak to the nation tonight. I think he's going to declare victory on the war in Iran. He's going to be like the guy that spiked the ball on the 10-yard line, right, before he got in the end zone, in an effort to try to pivot out of what is happening, get ahead of. That's my prediction. You all check me tomorrow and see if I'm true, right? But it is like spiking the ball before you get to the end zone, right? You saw the guy do that. But all in all, I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank Lisa Rice and the team at the National Fair Housing Alliance for really trying to confront AI and have a balanced conversation about what it means. We've got a number of tremendous challenges ahead of us as a nation. And AI, at the National Urban League, we have stood up, just for everyone's benefit, what we call Project Genius. And it's got 3 components to it. One component is to figure out how we use AI to manage our own enterprise. We are a very large nonprofit. We have a network of 94 affiliates. We have almost 3,000 employees nationally. We have revenues of almost $750 million. We serve millions of people through our direct services. We got to figure, and we capture a lot of data. And one time, some of my frustration with capturing all the data is that it turns into gobbledygook. We know this, we know that, but how do you sort it so that it's a tool, not just for reporting, but a tool for leadership and a tool for determination of strategic history. So we're going to do that is one component to it. The second component of it is we are working on trying to stand up our job and workforce development programs to train people for the jobs that AI is going to create, right? And so that's been a journey because we've got to not only stand up the idea on how to do it, we got to get the funding. And in this environment, increasingly, the funding has to come from the private sector. And the third element of the program is all about what we've been talking about this morning, the proper regulatory framework, the guardrails, civil rights. We're working on a white paper, right? That's going to come out in a month. That's going to try to address some of these issues as well. So we are trying, Lisa, to lean in a balanced way, in a responsible way, to not run away and be Chicken Little or just embrace it as though it's the latest and greatest thing and that it'll solve all of our problems. And so we have to have a point of view on that. And so we're going to be, and we just thank you for your long-standing leadership of over a generation. And you deserve a round of applause. Lots of, I sometimes think that sometimes the Federal Reserve functions like the Vatican. They hide in the Sistine Chapel and don't come out to talk. But so it's great that you've come to engage, with us in a very candid way and in a wonderful way. So I just want to, thank you very much for being here and look forward to continuing work together and continuing conversations on a really important issue that challenges our nation. So let's give the governor another big round of applause and thank him for being here. And I think I've seen the hook over there. They're saying we've gone over time, but it was a good conversation. We could stay here and talk a lot longer.
Thank you so much. I had a real pleasure. Thank you.